Ever wanted to time travel? Forget the fancy machines, just try finding a parking spot in Manhattan and you'll feel like you've gone back to the Stone Age. Seriously, in New York, parallel parking is an Olympic sport. But let's really rewind to the 1950s, when New York City was basically the world's biggest movie set, jazz was the Wi-Fi, and everyone dressed like they were on their way to a wedding, even if they were just buying milk. If you wore sweatpants outside, someone would call the cops. So, what was it really like to live in New York in the 1950s? Let's take a stroll down memory lane, just watch out for the taxis. They haven't slowed down since Eisenhower was president, and their brakes are just a suggestion. First, the Skyline. The Empire State Building was the king of the city, the Chrysler Building was its shiny sidekick, and the United Nations showed up in 1952 like, hey, let's solve world peace, but first, bagels. If you wanted to impress someone, you just pointed at the skyline and said, yeah, I live here. Instant cool points. Unless you were from New Jersey, then you just said you were from the area, and hoped nobody asked follow-up questions. Back then, almost 8 million people called New York home. That's a lot of people, and somehow, they all managed to fit on the same subway car at 8 a.m. The city was a patchwork of neighborhoods. Brooklyn had brownstones and more stoops than a Dr. Seuss book. The Lower East Side was packed tighter than a can of sardines. Harlem was the jazz capital, and Uptown was so fancy, even the pigeons wore bow ties. If you saw a pigeon in pearls, you just minded your business. A typical day. You woke up to the sound of your neighbor's radio, the smell of fresh bagels, and the distant honking of a cab driver who's been angry since 1947. The subway was the original escape room. If you made it to your stop with your dignity and your hat, you won. Street vendors sold hot dogs, pretzels, and dreams. Kids played stickball in the streets, and if you broke a window, you just ran faster than the landlord. If you got caught, you blamed it on the kid from Jersey. Families didn't have much, but they had each other. And by each other, I mean everyone knew your business. Privacy. That was for people in the suburbs. In New York, if you sneezed, 3 neighbors said, bless you, one offered you chicken soup, and another asked if you were contagious. On weekends, it was off to Coney Island. You'd ride the cyclone, eat a Nathan's hot dog, and try not to lose your lunch. If it was hot, you'd open a fire hydrant and turn the street into a water park. Who needs a pool when you've got city plumbing and a wrench? The only lifeguard was your grandma yelling from the window, don't get your shoes wet. Fashion. Oh, it was serious. Men wore suits and hats, even if they were just taking out the trash. Women rocked dresses, gloves, and pearls, because you never knew when you'd bump into your ex, your boss, or Frank Sinatra. Teenagers started rebelling with leather jackets and blue jeans. The city was basically a giant episode of Grease, minus the singing, well, mostly. If you didn't have a comb in your back pocket, were you even a teenager? The 1950s invented the teenager. Suddenly, kids weren't just small adults, they had their own music, their own slang, and their own way of rolling their eyes. Rock and roll was everywhere, and if you couldn't dance the twist, you at least pretended you could. Badly. If you had a jukebox, you had friends. If you had 2 jukeboxes, you were the mayor. Music was the city's heartbeat. Harlem was the place for jazz, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Miles Davis. In the Bronx and Brooklyn, doo-wop groups sang on street corners. If you didn't have a band, you had a group of friends and a lot of enthusiasm. Sometimes, that was enough. If you could harmonize, you were basically a celebrity. If you couldn't, you just sang louder. You could walk down 125th Street and hear music coming from every doorway. If you didn't hear music, you were probably in the library, and even then, someone was probably humming. If you heard silence, you were definitely lost. Broadway was booming. Shows like Guys and Dolls and West Side Story lit up the theaters. If you wanted to make it big, this was the place. Just don't trip over a chorus line. And if you did, just jazz hands your way out of it. If you could tap dance, you got a free coffee. Hungry? New York in the 50s was a food paradise. Jewish delis served pastrami on rice so good it could make you cry. Italian bakeries smelled like heaven. Chinatown had dim sum and noodles. And diners? Coffee, pie, and cheesecake that could double as a doorstop. Calories didn't count if you walked everywhere, right? If you didn't leave a restaurant in a food coma, did you even eat? If you left hungry, you did something wrong. The city was a melting pot, literally. New arrivals from Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America brought their own flavors. If you didn't like what was cooking on your block, just walk a few more blocks. Someone's grandma was always making something amazing. And if you were lucky, she'd invite you in. Or at least yell at you for standing too close to the window. If you left hungry, it was your own fault. People came to New York with nothing and found a home. The city gave them a shot. And if you could make it here, you could make it anywhere, except maybe New Jersey, but that's another story. If you made it in New Jersey, you just moved to New York and started over. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine and cheesecake. Discrimination was real, and life could be tough. But the city's diversity was its superpower, a patchwork quilt, sometimes with a few holes, but always colorful. If you didn't fit in, you just started your own club. The economy was booming. Wall Street was busy, the garment district was buzzing, and if you owned a sewing machine, you were basically a superhero. For many, New York was the land of opportunity. For others, it was the land of, I hope my landlord doesn't raise the rent again. Spoiler, they did. Politics? Oh boy. The city was run by big personalities. Mayor William O'Dwyer, Robert Moses, the guy who built half the city and bulldozed the other half. Moses built highways, bridges, and parks, but also moved thousands of families. He was like the Monopoly man, but with more concrete. If you saw a bulldozer, you just moved your stuff and didn't ask questions. Tammany Hall was fading, but if you wanted something done, you still needed to know a guy who knew a guy. And maybe slip him a little something under the table. Just saying. If you didn't know a guy, you knew a guy who knew a guy. But let's not sugarcoat it, crime was a thing. Gangs roamed the streets, the mafia ran parts of the city, and film noir movies made it all look way cooler than it actually was. If you heard footsteps behind you, you just walked faster and hoped for the best. If you made it home with your wallet, it was a good day. West Side Story wasn't just a musical, it was inspired by real gang rivalries. New York was a place of dreams and danger. Sometimes both at the same time. If you snapped your fingers in an alley, you better be ready to dance or run. The 50s were also about change. Harlem's black community was fighting for equality. Puerto Rican immigrants were building vibrant neighborhoods. People marched, protested, and demanded their rights. If you wanted to be heard, you had to shout, preferably over the sound of a passing subway. If you could get a word in edgewise, you were a legend. Creativity was everywhere. Midtown galleries had artists like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. In Greenwich Village, beat poets read their work in smoky coffeehouses. If you didn't have a beret, you probably felt left out. If you had a goatee, you got a discount on coffee. The Museum of Modern Art and the Met drew crowds from all over. The city was alive with creativity, a place where anything seemed possible, and sometimes, a little weird. If you didn't understand the art, you just nodded and said, interesting. Sports. The Yankees were kings. Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra, legends. The Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants were hometown heroes, until they left for California in 1957, and Brooklyn still hasn't forgiven them. When the Dodgers left, it was like the city lost a family member. People are still in therapy. If you mention the Dodgers in Brooklyn, bring tissues. Basketball, boxing, hockey, if you didn't play, you cheered. Loudly. Sometimes too loudly. If you didn't lose your voice at a game, were you even there? If you didn't argue with a stranger about the score, you missed out. The 50s were a time of big changes. TV was taking over, families gathered around to watch I Love Lucy and The Ed Sullivan Show. New cars filled the streets, and the skyline kept reaching higher. The atomic age brought excitement and anxiety. Air raid drills, fallout shelters, because nothing says peace of mind like hiding under your desk. If you survived a drill, you got a gold star and a cookie. Family life was changing, too. The baby boom was on, schools were packed, and new suburbs were popping up. But for many, the city was still home. We lived in a small apartment, but it was filled with love. And noise. Lots of noise. If you wanted privacy, you had to hide in the closet, and even then, someone would knock and ask if you were okay. If you had your own room, you were basically royalty. Moms shopped at local markets, dads commuted to work, and kids dreamed of a brighter future. The 1950s saw the start of a big move to the suburbs. Places like Levittown offered affordable homes and a taste of the American dream. But New York never lost its pull. For those who stayed, it was still the center of the universe. If you left, you always came back for the pizza. The city was home to legends. Marilyn Monroe filmed The 7-Year Itch on Lexington Avenue, stopping traffic with her famous white dress. Frank Sinatra sang at the Paramount. Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier at Ebbets Field. Eleanor Roosevelt fought for human rights from her Manhattan apartment. You never knew who you'd see on the street. New York was full of stars, and not just the ones on Broadway. If you saw someone famous, you pretended not to care, but you told everyone later. The Cold War cast a shadow. Air raid sirens, civil defense drills, and the United Nations trying to keep the peace. If you wanted to save the world, you started in New York. Or at least, you tried. If you couldn't save the world, you could at least get a good slice of pizza. Faith was a big part of life. Churches, synagogues, mosques, everywhere. Street festivals celebrated saints and traditions from all over. Our church was the heart of the neighborhood. It brought people together, and sometimes, a really good potluck. If you missed the potluck, you missed half the fun.